Good morning, everybody. This is the latest presentation on the Imperial War Graves Commission Experimental Cemeteries, 1918 to 1920, Part 1. Again, this is part of my Great War Details YouTube videos, and if you can like and subscribe, it helps. And you can also help by buying me a coffee on buymeacoffee.com. Okay, visiting the Commonwealth War Grave cemeteries on the Western Front, they seem to have been there forever, well, at least from the First World War. They're all slightly different. The greatest differences are in size and environment, yet they all maintain a consistent style. Most contain similar features. In past videos, I've looked at ideas for the headstones, the cemetery cross, and the war stone. The gardening was already underway, suggested by Arthur Hill of Kew Gardens. How were the cemeteries designed? More cemeteries with familiar features. Here, Danzig Alley and Caterpillar Valley. Fabian Ware formed the Imperial War Graves Commission in May 1917, which changed to the Commonwealth War Graves Commission in 1960. The work until this point was registering and marking the graves through the Directorate of Graves Registration and Inquiries. Ware had worked on making the cemeteries more permanent by negotiating the transfer of the cemetery land to the UK in perpetuity with the French law of 29th of December 1915. Now he wanted to turn the simple enclosures into permanent cemeteries. Other than many isolated graves, cemeteries were formed where needed, close to where the men fell. Wooden crosses were often made by comrades in arms to mark the graves. The Imperial War Graves Commission marked and registered the graves. The cemeteries were still under the responsibility of the army. Some arrangement was made to line up the graves. The cemetery was often enclosed with a simple barbed wire fence. The cemeteries would need to be designed. Fabian Ware was already in contact with architects and other interested people. Edwin Lutyens and Herbert Baker were the first of the soon-to-be principal architects for the Imperial War Graves Commission. They were invited to visit France in July 1917 to look at the war cemeteries. Reginald Blomfield, the third principal architect, visited the Western Front cemeteries in early February 1918. All three architects were invited to become principal architects on 6th of March 1918, but had already produced their reports. Fabian Ware appointed Sir Frederick Kenyon to oversee the architectural treatment of the cemeteries in the first Imperial War Graves Commission meeting on 20th of November 1917. Kenyon presented his report on 18th of February 1918. Kenyon was the director of the British Museum, but his report showed a very thorough understanding and sensitivity of the issues at hand. The reports produced by Kenyon and the three architects suggested many ideas and raised many questions. Discussions would continue for a long time, but they set a few main themes which were more or less agreed by everyone, such as the main principle of equality of treatment for officers and men alike, resulting in a single form of stone headstone. The headstones to face the enemy, normally towards the east. The rows of headstones giving the appearance as of a battalion on parade. A war stone or altar placed in each cemetery on the east side. A cemetery cross in each cemetery placed for maximum effect. And a shelter to keep a cemetery register could be combined with the entrance. Needed also a perimeter wall or hedge, and then sensitive planting around the wide level areas of grass between the rows of headstones. In the second meeting of the Imperial War Graves Commission in February 1918, it was agreed to use the three architects to design and build 3 experimental cemeteries, and Kenyon would overlook the compliance of the designs. The three cemeteries chosen were at Forceville, Louvencourt and Le Tréport. Not long after this decision, the German army started their spring offensive, rendering any visits very dangerous. It was Blomfield who ended up supervising the design for all three, probably as Lutyens and Baker were often busy on their site in New Delhi, India. At this point, February 1918, these three cemeteries would expose some of the practical and design issues. There was no apparent brief for these cemeteries other than the guidelines from Kenyon and the results of previous meetings and correspondence between various interested parties. The cemeteries were to be regarded as experimental and as offering some basis for estimating the cost of the works as a whole. So how would they design these cemeteries? The cemeteries chosen were behind the lines. The war was still going on and would continue for another 9 months. However, in less than 2 months, the German advance had reached to within half a dozen kilometres of the closest at Louvencourt and Forceville. So you can see here the advance of 1918 is the blue dashed line. And they'd already approached the old front line of 1916. The Forceville communal cemetery extension, as the name suggests, is next to an existing civil cemetery, which had field ambulances nearby from 1915. Louvencourt Military Cemetery, used from 1915, also had field ambulances nearby. Le Tréport Military Cemetery was always safe, being on the coast. Here there were 5 military hospitals with a total of more than 10,000 beds. So here we can see the sample cemeteries in orange, Louvencourt, Forceville and Le Tréport way over here. Work on the cemeteries was begun in May 1918, according to records, but this must have been the survey and early design work. The massive German attack starting on 21st of March 1918 must have put a spanner in the works. Major Charles Holdham became the 4th principal architect in 1920. The contract for Le Tréport was placed in November 1918, but work on the cemetery was delayed on account of difficulties of transport owing to demands on the railways during the period of demobilisation. The contracts for Forceville and Louvencourt were placed in April 1919. So this is Forceville in 1919. The civil cemetery is behind the trees. Forceville Community Cemetery extension was the first to be completed. A small cemetery with 304 burials plus 7 German burials. If planning started in May 1918, then there were additional burials of 45 in April 1918, 25 in May 1918, with a total of 89 extra burials in 1918, the latest being on the 21st of August 1918. So this cemetery is attractively open at the entrance on this eastern side, offering views across the cemetery. The western hedge and low stone wall and hedge allow free views of the countryside beyond. It is completely shielded from the French civil cemetery by a row of trees here. Access is separate from the French civil cemetery via a track on the eastern side of the main cemetery. Many communal cemetery extensions are attached to local cemeteries, often accessed through the French civil cemetery, like at Wimereux. A main communal cemetery extension here is at the back of a French civil cemetery. And at Mareuil Communal Cemetery, it is in the middle of a French cemetery. So this is Forceville, finished in 1920. At the back here is the Stone of Remembrance, but behind that is a stone wall. So this is Forceville today, but when I was there it was under repairs. So at the back we can see this stone wall. We can see it again here with the the war stone of remembrance in front. And now the hedge has grown a bit. One of the best effects of this cemetery is difficult to see in this photo because of all the repair equipment and fences, but it's this small stone wall here which makes a wedge shape, forcing itself gently into the countryside. In September 1920, a reporter from the Times visited the cemetery, describing it as the most perfect, the noblest, the most classically beautiful memorial that any loving heart or any proud nation could desire to their heroes fallen in a foreign land. Notable burials, there's a Private John Lewis of the 5th Dorsetshire Regiment who was shot at dawn, 19th of April, for desertion in 1917, for desertion aged 21. The last burials in the cemetery are 10 men and 1 officer of the 38th Battalion Machine Gun Corps. All died on the same day, 21st of August 1918. A large group to be killed together behind the lines. Strange because the fighting of the 38th Division on that date was a dozen kilometres east towards the River Ancre on the Somme. And a Private Martin Morgan was noted as being a driver in the 38th Machine Gun Corps. So what happened? The War Diary of the 38th Machine Gun Corps reveals the answers. At 10 p.m. on the 21st of August 1918, a hostile plane flying very high dropped 2 bombs on B Company transport. Their camp was just south of Forceville, about 1 kilometre from the cemetery. 1 officer and 10 other ranks were killed, 11 other ranks wounded, all from the 38th Machine Gun Corps. As well as 3 rider horses and 10 light draft horses killed, 3 rider horses and 11 light draft horses were wounded. 3 limbers were damaged and other damage to pack saddles, wheel harness and lead harness. It was the Machine Gun Corps Transport Group, due to move next day to cross the River Ancre to arrive south of Thiepval. So many didn't get there. So in the cemetery, the actual burial position of the 10 other ranks are in the front, orange marked here. But strangely, the officer, Lieutenant Pugh, has been placed higher up in the cemetery, even though he died on the same day. There could be another victim from that bombing, and it is possibly Corporal Edward Aaron Hope of the 38th Machine Gun Corps. He died on the 22nd of August 1918, the next day. He died of wounds, so he could have been on his way back to a dressing station, as he's buried at Varennes Military Cemetery, 3 kilometres from Forceville, on the way to the 38th Casualty Clearing Station at Fiennes-Villers. Louvencourt Military Cemetery. This one was drawn up by Major Holden, assisted by Colonel Hickson. Both architects served in the war. The drawings were approved by Blomfield in March 1919. Here are 151 Commonwealth burials, 30 from 1915, 72 from 1916, 3 from 1917, 46 from 1918. There are 75 French burials from 1915 and 3 World War II burials. Here too, another 47 burials were added between 4th of March and 22nd of July 1918, after the initial designing. So here we've got a plan with the Louvencourt village up here and Liel-Villers to the south. This is the cemetery in 1919. Here, finished in 1920. And here you can see that along this wall there are lots of wooden crosses. Now these are the French burials. And you can also see stone paving in the cemetery. And note the position of these trees. On the next picture, those young trees are not there anymore, but these have grown very well. And you can see the French cemetery headstones along this wall. These two trees survived, and these are the three burials from 1945. And this is a new entrance. So here you've got a general view looking south of the cemetery. The choice of white stone walling was bold. The stone has retained its colour, more or less, but the foundations and/or drought has led to many cracks in the walling. Louvencourt Cemetery is now only open to the south, west and west. Trees now obscure the other views. In 1981, the southern and eastern directions were unobstructed. In an Imperial War Graves Commission meeting in February 1920, the question of French in British cemeteries and British in French cemeteries was discussed, citing Louvencourt Cemetery as an example. The French erected their own headstones at Louvencourt and agreed to pay their proportion of the cost of constructing the wall. Despite the generally less elaborate French cemeteries, it was decided that some of the costs of the shared cemeteries would be proportional to the number of burials. In this 20th meeting of the Imperial War Graves Commission, the opinion was expressed that the Commission should act as generously as possible towards the French. In the initial plans, there were stone pathways throughout the cemetery, rather like the central pathway which still exists at Gardes Cemetery Les Boeufs. Unlike Forceville, with only one low stone wall, this cemetery has a complete thick stone perimeter wall. The stone has lasted well, but the ground conditions have led to many cracks and broken stonework. This may be part of the general sécheresse in France, which is wreaking havoc in buildings. The effect of this stone wall when viewed from the north is very pleasing, matching the far horizon beyond, an experiment which has been successful. However, Louvencourt has no entrance shelter building, so the register and visitors book are at risk from the elements. Here is the book in this cubbyhole next to the steps in the access to the cemetery. Notable burials, one is Brigadier General Charles Bertie Prowse, DSO, of the General Staff. Prowse Point Farm at Plug Street was named after him. Another notable burial is Lieutenant Roland Layton, known as the fiancé of Vera Brittain from the Testament of Youth book and TV series. Frederick Martin Barrett and Private Harry MacDonald were both shot at dawn, not on the same day. One 10th of July 1917, the other 4th of November 1916. Le Tréport. Here we're on the coast, as you can see on the picture. Here are 445 burials, whereas Forceville and Louvencourt are only 7 and 10 kilometres from the 1916 front line respectively. Le Tréport is on the Channel coast, 91 kilometres away. The first burial here is from 28th of December 1914, most 277 from 1915, some 162 from 1916, 6 from 1917, the latest being 12th of April 1917, plus 1 German from 1915 and 2 Germans from 1916. There is 1 known and 3 unknowns from World War II. So here you can see the position of the Tréport right on the coast. The first burial is in the foreground, Private M. Dunn of the 2nd Royal Dublin Fusiliers, who died on the 28th of December 1914. This is the view slightly towards the south, with the existing French cemetery behind the wall. It will be noticed that this cemetery is now within a French civil cemetery. Criticism has been made concerning the high walls around this cemetery, but heed needs to be taken of the French law for town cemeteries at that time. The law of l'an 1223 prairial, translated from the revolutionary date as the 12th of June 1814, states that a cemetery should be at the outside of a town with walls 2 meters high. So here we see the British cemetery here, and there are French graves on three sides: the south side, the back side here on the east side, and the northern side. Originally there was only the north side, and the road is very, very close. However, some criticism of the high walls may come from an early inspection of the cemetery before it took on its current layout. This photo on a postcard shows a wall around the cemetery installed before 1916. The cemetery is smaller and does not have the back wall and buildings. So here we see this, obviously a 2 meter odd height wall onto the French cemetery, and it continued to match all the way on the other three sides, and beyond there is nothing. This is the newly completed cemetery in 1920. The high wall retained on the left is next to the French civil cemetery, so this hasn't changed, this wall. But the walls on the two other sides have been lowered, and at the back they need a higher wall for the shelters and the backdrop to the war stone at this point here. The two other experimental cemeteries at Forceville and Louvencourt have followed the guidelines in having the headstones facing the enemy to the east. Here they are facing west. Facing west, home across the channel. Some burials at Le Tréport. There's a Brigadier General Henry Buchanan Kirk of the 2nd Argyll and Southern Highlanders, who died 12th of May 1916. He was 49 years old, and there are two chaplains, one of the YMCA and another one of the Army Chaplain Department. And last but not least, there's Margaret Trevelyan Arnold, VAD, who died of pneumonia on the 12th of March 1916, aged 31. Now this is interesting because her burial is on a postcard, and you can see the four walls of the old cemetery in 1916, and there are a lot of people there attending her funeral. A lot of nurses here in their uniform, and she is buried just behind this wall at around this point here on the left hand side. Okay, so many thanks to the Commonwealth War Graves Commission allowing the use of their archive photos, and that is the end of this first part. Hold on for the second part. So thanks for watching.